Take a look at the eastern Mediterranean around the year 1200 BCE. You have major players like Egypt, the Mycenaeans, the Hittite Empire, and Assyria, all tied together by a glowing network of international trade. Thanks to a revolution in farming, these states produced massive food surpluses, allowing them to support complex governments and rapid technological innovation. That wealth fueled the growth of huge, diverse cities. People traded goods and ideas across thousands of miles, leaving the era of tiny, isolated city-states far behind. Humanity had reached a high watermark of prosperity and organization. Their sudden destruction is a jarring reversal. Within a single generation, almost every one of these advanced states faced an existential crisis. The trade network went dark, and the empires simply vanished off the map. When archaeologists look at the ruins from this period, they find the bare stone foundations of highly fortified cities that were burned to the ground and grand palaces that were permanently abandoned. Historians originally blamed this destruction on a wave of mysterious foreign invaders, but modern forensic evidence suggests the invaders were just the final blow in a sequence of interconnected failures. The first of these failures was environmental. Modern pollen samples from the region show that a severe 300-year dry event began right before the collapse. Rainfall dropped to levels that could no longer sustain basic agriculture. Across Cyprus, Syria, and Greece, crops simply stopped growing. Without that massive food surplus, starvation set in quickly. People were forced to abandon the massive cities they had built just to survive. Archaeological evidence from several Greek cities shows a specific pattern. Fires confined solely to the palace structures in the city centers. Because the surrounding residential areas were left standing, it points toward internal uprisings, where starving populations targeted their own ruling classes rather than a general invasion. Long before a single foreign soldier stepped foot on their shores, these empires were already rotting from the inside due to climate starvation. While the climate was drying out, the region was hit by a second crisis. The eastern Mediterranean entered a brutal 50-year period riddled with massive earthquakes. Cities in Greece and Anatolia that were already severely weakened by famine were shaken to pieces, forcing the surviving populations to leave the rubble behind. These local disasters triggered a collapse in the era's most vital supply chain, the production of bronze. Making bronze required two ingredients. You needed 9 parts copper, which was easily mined on the island of Cyprus, but you also needed 1 part tin, which is extremely rare. To get enough tin to meet demand, these empires had to haul it along a fragile 3,000-kilometer supply route from modern-day Afghanistan, or even as far away as Britain. The earthquakes shatters that route. The widespread famines and seismic destruction halted international trade. Without tin, it became impossible for anyone to forge new bronze or repair their advanced weaponry. With the supply lines snapped, the economic and technological backbone of the ancient world was broken. This is the environment the Sea Peoples entered. They were a loose coalition of climate refugees from across the Mediterranean, migrating on boats and wagons with their families and all their worldly possessions. This Egyptian carving at Medinet Habu shows how empires fought. Armies were built around the chariot, fast, firing heavy bows from a distance. Because chariots were expensive, armies protected them with rigid lines of spearmen. Infantry held the line, while chariots picked off targets. The Sea Peoples fought completely differently. They discarded chariots altogether and attacked as highly mobile, aggressive infantry runners. Wielding long swords and javelins, these runners swarmed from different directions. They bypassed the tight spear lines and surrounded the expensive chariots, destroying them before the drivers had space to turn. The major powers had spent centuries perfecting a rigid military machine. It was useless against the chaotic, swarming tactics of these desperate refugees. The final stand of the Bronze Age took place at the mouth of the Nile. Pharaoh Ramses III barely managed to defeat the Sea Peoples, and he only did it by abandoning traditional tactics and massing every spearman he had to meet them on foot. Egypt survived the invasion, but the effort left them permanently weakened. They were reduced to a second-rate power, while virtually every other empire in the region was wiped off the map forever. Historians now use the systems collapse theory to explain this sudden, total ending. The Sea Peoples on their own were only a medium-level military threat. Under normal circumstances, a healthy Bronze Age empire could have easily defeated them. The system's collapse theory indicates that the era ended through a convergence of catastrophes. Climate change, natural disasters, and severed trade routes struck simultaneously, each crisis multiplying the destructive power of the others until the system reached a breaking point.
3,000 years ago, the Eastern Mediterranean was a bustling hub of international commerce. Merchant ships crisscrossed the seas, carrying gold, spices, and exotic goods to thriving coastal cities. This map shows the four major powers of the era: the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Babylonians, as the ancient world's most sophisticated economic system, generating immense wealth through its reliance on shared resources and cross-border cooperation. Then, right around the year 1200 BC, this entire thriving network violently vanished. To figure out why, we have to look at the one technology holding their world together. Their militaries and economies ran entirely on a single specific alloy: bronze. But there's a serious geographical catch to making bronze. It requires two raw materials, copper and tin, and you rarely ever find those ores in the same place. Look at this diagram. To forge just one standard sword, you need roughly 90% copper and 10% tin. Because those deposits were so scattered, these empires had to rely on fragile supply chains stretching thousands of miles just to make basic tools. Their interconnected trade network was exactly what made them strong, but it also left them dependent on a complex system that had to work perfectly, all the time. The first domino to fall was the weather. A sudden extreme shift in global climate patterns hit the Mediterranean hard. Severe, multi-decade droughts scorched the earth. The lush river valleys and vast plains that produced the food for millions of people simply dried up. Right alongside the devastating drought, the entire region was rocked by a sudden series of violent tectonic earthquakes. We can still see the evidence today. The heavy stone masonry protecting Mycenaean palaces and strongholds was physically shaken apart and left in ruins. A healthy empire can rebuild after an earthquake, but when the ground is shaking and nothing will grow, the baseline survival of millions of people gets pushed past the breaking point. With the crops failing year after year, widespread, catastrophic famine set in across the known world. Mass starvation does terrible things to a society. Desperate, starving citizens quickly ignited violent internal rebellions, fracturing the great empires from the inside out. Once the civil wars began, it became impossible to protect the long, winding roads and sea routes that kept the ancient world functioning. The broken trade routes meant the flow of copper and tin stopped entirely. Look at these unused ingots. Without a steady supply of raw materials, state armies couldn't replace their armor or forge new bronze weapons. The environmental disaster created a social shock. The major powers were stripped of their wealth, their food, and their physical defenses, right before a massive external threat arrived. That threat came from the ocean. A violent coalition known to history as the Sea Peoples began raiding the coastlines. The Sea Peoples consisted of desperate refugee populations, forced from their homes by the same regional droughts and famines before turning to maritime piracy to survive. Under normal circumstances, the great empires could have repelled them, but facing a starving, divided, and practically unarmed defense, these maritime invaders completely overwhelmed the shores. The historical records left by the few survivors, like this Egyptian relief carving, verify exactly what happened: brutal, chaotic combat against an enemy with nothing left to lose. This chain of events, from drought and famine to internal rebellion and external migration, effectively paralyzed the ancient world and delivered the final blow to its major powers. When the dust settled after 1200 BC, the vibrant international community of the Late Bronze Age had been reduced to ash and rubble. The towering cities were abandoned, the survivors scattered, forced to scratch out a living in small, isolated, and impoverished farming villages. The cultural devastation was absolute. Across multiple regions, the incredibly complex writing systems that recorded their history, trade, and laws were either wiped out or entirely forgotten. The total collapse reset the clock on human progress,
plunging the Mediterranean basin into an impoverished, centuries-long dark age. It's easy to look back at the ancient world and assume we are immune to their mistakes. But look at this comparison. We simply swapped the fragile tin supply chains of 1200 BC for our own hyper-connected, globalized networks of semiconductors, rare earth metals, and just-in-time shipping. The greatest danger to a highly advanced society is its own complexity. The Bronze Age disaster is a warning. It proves that progress is never permanent. Ignoring the hidden vulnerabilities of a deeply connected world is simply an invitation to collapse.
All right, let's dive right in. We're going to travel back in time today. But this isn't just a history lesson. Think of it more as a critical business consultation from the ancient world. We're going to explore a catastrophic failure from 3,000 years ago to understand a risk that, I promise you, is hiding in plain sight in your own organization.
So let me ask you, straight up, what's your plan B? And I don't mean for a market downturn or for a single supplier going bust. I mean for a real systemic shock. A moment when the fundamental connections that power your entire business just snap.
Because about 3,000 years ago, the most powerful leaders of their day, the CEOs and kings of the Bronze Age, they faced that exact scenario. They'd built this globalized world of incredible complexity and wealth. They thought it was too big to fail. They were wrong, and they had absolutely no plan B.
This whole story, this warning from the past, it all begins with a concept every single one of you is intimately familiar with: the supply chain. But what happens when our relentless search for efficiency makes that chain dangerously brittle?
Think about it. We've spent the last 50 years perfecting just-in-time delivery, minimizing inventory, and building these hyper-efficient global networks. And it's a marvel of optimization. It really is. But in doing so, we've systematically squeezed out every bit of redundancy. We've removed all the buffers, all the slack in the system that you need to absorb a shock. And that creates a hidden and, frankly, a terrifying fragility. And this is exactly where the past sends us a crucial warning. See, this isn't a new problem. We aren't the first globalized civilization to fall in love with efficiency at the expense of resilience, not by a long shot.
You've probably heard the philosopher George Santayana's famous line, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Well, for today's global economy, the period we absolutely have to remember is the late Bronze Age.
So let's go there, to that first global economy. And you've got to forget any stereotype of primitive people in huts. I want you to picture bustling port cities, international treaties, and complex trade routes stretching for thousands of miles.
What's so amazing is the analogy here. This really was the internet of its day. You had the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in modern-day Turkey, the Egyptians. They were all connected in this incredibly sophisticated network. They were constantly trading raw materials, luxury goods, new ideas. Entire kingdoms would specialize in producing one specific thing and then rely on trade for everything else. Sound familiar?
And this right here, this illustrates the core vulnerability perfectly. Their entire civilization, their tools, their weapons, their whole economy was built on bronze. Now, to make bronze, you need two things: copper, which was pretty common, and tin, which was incredibly scarce. Tin mines were few and far between, meaning this absolutely critical resource had to be shipped across vast distances. It's just like how our modern batteries rely on lithium and scarce cobalt. Their entire technological base depended on a fragile, long-distance supply chain for one single critical component.
So they were living at the very top of this highly optimized but incredibly fragile system. And then in what is basically the blink of a historical eye, that whole system just shattered.
Around the year 1200 BC. That's the date that archaeologists like me, we circle it in red. It's the moment when, with shocking speed, the lights just go out across this entire interconnected world.
We call it the Bronze Age collapse. And let me be clear, this wasn't a slow decline. No, it was a rapid, cascading, systemic failure. Within a single generation, great empires vanished. Major cities were completely abandoned. Entire writing systems were lost, and the population of the region just plummeted.
So how did it happen? Well, historians still debate what the initial spark was. Could have been climate change, or migrations, or warfare. But the mechanism of the collapse is crystal clear. It was a domino effect. First, the key trade routes that carried that essential tin were disrupted, and boom, suddenly you can't make bronze. That leads directly to economic breakdown. Armies can't be equipped, tools can't be made. This fuels massive political instability, uprisings, civil wars, and that leads to total societal collapse. A supply chain problem became a civilization-ending event.
So what can we, sitting here 3,000 years later, actually learn from these ruins? This is the most important part of this whole explainer. How do we translate this ancient history into actionable intelligence for your business right now?
The crucial lesson is this. The Bronze Age kings bet everything on efficiency. We have to build for resilience. So what does that actually mean? It means building redundancy into your systems, even if it looks inefficient on a spreadsheet. It means actively diversifying your suppliers so that no single point of failure can take you down. It means recognizing that a little bit of slack in a system isn't waste, it's a strategic asset. And critically, it means stress testing not just for one failure, but for multiple, systemic shocks. Maybe it even means cultivating local capabilities so you're not entirely dependent on a supply line that stretches halfway across the world. Because here's the fundamental takeaway. In a simple system, things fail one at a time. But in a complex, interconnected system like ours, and just like the one in the late Bronze Age, the great risk is that everything fails at once. In that kind of environment, efficiency is fragile. Resilience is the only true, sustainable competitive advantage. So I'll leave you with this one question to take back to your teams. Look at your own networks, your own dependencies, your own relentless drive for efficiency. And ask yourselves, honestly, are we building a resilient future, or are we just engineering a more efficient collapse? All right, today we're opening one of history's coldest cases. We're talking about a moment 3,000 years ago when an entire interconnected world of empires and superpowers just vanished. I mean, what could possibly wipe advanced civilizations clean off the map all at once? Let's get our detective hats on and investigate. So, our crime scene, it covers the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Around 1200 BCE, the glittering world of the Late Bronze Age, a time of powerful, hyper-connected empires, it all came to this sudden, violent end. Palaces burned to the ground, entire cities were abandoned, and in some places, they even forgot how to write for centuries. The big question is, what happened? Okay, like any good investigation, our first step is to identify the victims. And wow, the list here is just staggering. We're not talking about some minor kingdoms on the fringe. We're talking about the Hittites, a superpower in what's now Turkey, who went toe-to-toe with Egypt. The Mycenaeans of Greece, the civilization of legendary heroes like Agamemnon. Cyprus, the ridiculously wealthy center of the global copper trade. And amazing coastal cities like Ugarit, these bustling multicultural hubs. All of them gone.
What's incredible is that we actually have first-hand accounts of the terror. This right here is from a desperate letter found in the ruins of Ugarit. The king is literally pleading for help, explaining that his own armies are away, leaving his kingdom wide open. You can just feel the panic in his words.
And then there's this. This is the final message ever sent from that city. It's just a fragment of a tablet, baked hard in the fire that destroyed the palace. It says, "Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it." That repetition, it's just haunting. It's the end of their world, captured right there on a piece of clay.
For a really long time, this whole collapse was a total mystery. But then, archaeologists in Egypt found a crucial piece of evidence, and it pointed to a single prime suspect.
On the walls of his massive temple at Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Ramses III carved this incredibly dramatic story. He described a huge wave of invaders, this mysterious confederation that came from the sea and just swept down the coast, destroying everything in their path. The Egyptians gave them a name, the Sea Peoples.
Ramses' account paints this picture of a totally unstoppable force. And this wasn't just an army, it was a mass migration. They came with their families and wagons and boats, overwhelming kingdoms that had stood for centuries. So what made them so darn effective?
Well, it really came down to a clash of military styles. You see, the Bronze Age empires had perfected chariot warfare. You've got to think of the chariot as the tank of its day. It was expensive, state-of-the-art, and all about speed and firepower. But the Sea Peoples, they fought differently. They were these highly mobile infantry, what some historians have called runners, who used javelins and long swords with this insane aggression. They could swarm a chariot, get behind the big defensive lines, and basically turn the empire's greatest strength into their biggest weakness.
So, the Sea Peoples. Sounds like an open and shut case, right? But any good investigator knows there's almost always more to the story. And sure enough, other clues started popping up that really complicated the picture.
First off, the Bronze Age was built on, well, bronze. And to make bronze, you need copper, which mostly came from Cyprus, and tin, which is incredibly rare. The main supply was all the way over in modern-day Afghanistan. This created this really complex, really expensive, and, as it turns out, shockingly fragile international supply chain. Any disruption, like, say, a few pirates or some raids, and the whole system could just grind to a halt.
As if that wasn't enough to deal with, we now have evidence that the entire region was getting hammered by what scientists call an earthquake storm. We're talking about a 50-year period of intense seismic activity, toppling palaces and wrecking infrastructure all across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. So cities were already weakened before any invaders even showed up.
But maybe the most damning piece of evidence of all, the real smoking gun. It comes from a source you would never expect: ancient pollen. By drilling down into the seabed, scientists analyzed pollen grains from this exact period. And what they found was evidence of a massive, crippling climate event, a drought that lasted for 300 years.
And once again, the written record backs this up completely. In those archives at Ugarit, we find these desperate letters. This one is from the great Hittite king himself, begging for shipments of grain, and he flat out states, it is a matter of life and death. Widespread crop failures meant famine, and famine leads to desperation and people moving to find food. Sound familiar?
Okay, so we have our prime suspect, the Sea Peoples, but we also have a fragile economy, natural disasters, and a climate catastrophe. It's time to put all the pieces together.
You know, the leading explanation for the Bronze Age collapse is something called systems collapse theory. Now that sounds really academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It argues that this wasn't about one single thing. It was a perfect storm, where a whole bunch of crises hit at the exact same time, and each one just made the others worse.
Let's just break down this domino effect, because it's wild. The 300-year drought causes massive famine. Famine leads to people abandoning cities and even overthrowing their own kings. These weakened, unstable states, they can't protect those vital long-distance trade routes anymore. Then, a bunch of earthquakes shatter what's left of their infrastructure. And into this world of chaos, a world that is already on its knees, that's when the Sea Peoples arrive.
So what's our final verdict in one of history's greatest cases?
Well, it turns out the Sea Peoples weren't the disease that killed the Bronze Age. They were a symptom. They were the final, decisive blow to an interconnected world that was already crumbling from within thanks to climate change, resource shortages, and natural disasters. They were the catalyst for sure, but they weren't the sole cause.
And that really leaves us with a pretty chilling final thought. These were complex, globalized societies, completely dependent on international trade and a stable climate, just like us. It really makes you wonder, if our world faced its own perfect storm of crises, are we so sure we'd do any better?